Good morning. Welcome to the Millyard Museum. My name is Christy. I'm the Director of Education. And welcome to our talk on Henry W. Herrick. And I just wanted to kind of do a little bit of housekeeping and tell you about some upcoming things we have here. The first thing that we have is the Henry W. Herrick exhibit, which is up until October 20th. And we have a really cool event coming up that kind of centers around that. My flyer. We have Manchester's Masters, an evening with the artist, and that is on Thursday, October 12th. It starts at 5 o'clock. Doors open at 5 o'clock. It starts around 5:30. It will highlight 10 Manchester artists. It is our fourth collaboration with the Majestic Theater, and their actors are going to be portraying these artists in the first person, as well as we're going to have original artwork on display that otherwise is kept in our archives. And one of the characters is going to be Henry W. Herrick. So if you would like to see Henry W. Herrick tell his story in first person, we would love for you to join us. You can buy tickets online or you can buy tickets on your way out, and there is a member discount. And we really look forward to having you there. We have some other great things coming up. We have our holiday open house on Saturday, December 2nd. It is a free event for the public. We do have a paid American Girl doll tea party, but for free we have refreshments, crafts for the kids. We have Santa and Mrs. Claus coming from 11 to 12:30, as well as a lecture to be determined in the evening. We would love to have you. And some very good discounts in the gift shop as well. So if you have some Christmas shopping that you'll like to do, Christmas is 100 days away as of today. I thought I would share that news with you. So hopefully you can join us for those things, and that you follow us on social media to stay updated for all the things that we do. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our Executive Director, Jeffrey Barraclough, and he's going to tell you a little more about this amazing Manchester artist.
Thank you, Christy, and thank you all for coming out on this kind of rainy, windy day. It's a pleasure to have you, and I'm excited to be able to talk to you this morning more about this really interesting person from Manchester's past, Henry W. Herrick. As Christy mentioned, we have our special exhibition going on right now called Henry W. Herrick, Manchester's Most Versatile Artist, which will come to a close in about a month. And so we wanted to take some time to go into even greater detail on his life, one of Manchester's most prominent artists, and highlight some of his many works. Herrick was an illustrator, he was an engraver, a painter, an author, a poet, and a historian. And so when naming this exhibit, we felt that the word versatile very aptly describes who Henry Herrick was and his many talents. Many of Herrick's works have been displayed at the Historic Association over the years, including in our permanent exhibit out here called Woven in Time, and then various temporary exhibitions in the past. The last large show was in 1969, though, so we felt it was certainly time for another exhibition of Herrick's works. And while he has been recognized for the large number of watercolors that he's painted in his later years, we wanted through this exhibition to give equal credit to his career as a book illustrator and an engraver. And so we hope we've accomplished that through this exhibit. Before I go into greater detail on some of his works, I want to take some time and look at the early life of Henry Herrick. Henry Walker Herrick was born on August 23rd, 1824, in Hopkinton, New Hampshire. He was a seventh-generation American, descended from Henry Herrick of Salem, who arrived in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1629. This is a drawing by Herrick of the home in which he was born. His father, Israel Herrick, was a country merchant and lumber dealer, and his mother, Martha Trow Herrick, was a talented amateur painter who, when Henry was a young boy, recognized and encouraged his pursuit of art. By the age of 8, he was painting flowers, birds, and other objects of nature with his mother's guidance. The family moved several times during Henry's childhood, living in Concord and Nashua before settling in Manchester by the early 1840s. As a young man, Herrick learned the art of wood engraving. after briefly doing some work here in Manchester, he went to New York City and pursued this as a career. Woodblock engraving was the principal mode of illustration for books and magazines at that time. And by the mid-19th century, this was coming into even higher demand by publishers. The public was increasingly expecting books and periodicals to be illustrated, and where once just a frontispiece illustration would have been considered sufficient, people were now becoming accustomed to seeing both illustrations in the text and full-page illustrations throughout a book. So in 1844, at the age of 20, he studied at the National Academy of Design in New York City. He soon began doing woodblock engraving for leading publishers, and his early work included engraving the illustrations of F.O.C. Darley, who was a very famous illustrator at the time, in Washington Irving's sketchbook. So Herrick did not do the illustrations here, but he did the engravings for Darley's illustrations. And then he soon began producing his own original designs to be used in book publications. He drew and painted a series of birds for the Lewis Prang Company that was considered to be, quote, unexcelled in natural prose and color. And he continued to really paint birds, and that was as a specialty throughout his career. He worked for many of the leading publishers of the time, including the Appletons, Harper and Brothers, Hurd and Houghton, Carter Brothers, and the American Tract Society. Identifying all of Herrick's illustrations can be very difficult because not all of his illustrations were signed. They were often anonymous, as was typical for book illustrations. However, we have been able to identify many of either illustrations that are signed or credited to him in a book's list of illustrations. And so some of the ones that we have on exhibit and that I'll be showing here are ones that we have been able to identify as Herrick, either because it was signed or because the book table of contents listed him as the illustrator. So the American Tract Society was one publisher that Herrick frequently illustrated for, probably one of the most, he worked for the American Tract Society the most. This, they put out a monthly children's magazine called the Child at Home publication, and these are illustrations from that publication in 1869 and 1870. The book Women of the Bible was published in 1868 by the Tract Society, and he illustrated several of the drawings in this book, including these here. There's a drawing of Ruth, a drawing of Jesus comforting Mary and Martha after the death of Lazarus, and then in the bottom is Isaac blessing Jacob. This is another book, Songs for the Little Ones at Home, published in 1884 by the American Tract Society, and Herrick is the illustrator here of this Sleigh Ride illustration. Hurd and Houghton, as I mentioned, was another publisher. They published the Riverside Magazine for young people in the 1860s, and he had several illustrations in this periodical. These are just a few of those. You can see his signature down in the corner there. And in 1869, Hurd and Houghton published a complete volume of Aesop's Fables that featured 111 illustrations by Herrick. And these are just a few of the more well-known fables: the ant and the grasshopper, the town mouse and the country mouse, the wind and the sun, and the proud peacock, I believe is what that one is. Harper's Weekly, very famous publication at the time, again published weekly newspapers. He illustrated for them. This is Life on the Farm, a really detailed drawing that he did in 1867. And this is a illustration published in Harper's Weekly called American Snowbirds. And again, you can see the details of the birds that he was able to draw. In 1852, I'll back up for a minute. In 1852, he would take a teaching job at the School of Design for Women, a newly founded all-women's design school in New York City. He taught at the school for 4 years, followed by 2 years serving as its principal. And he was an early advocate for equal employment rights for women in the engraving profession and was considered a pioneer in professional art education. The purpose of the school was to teach women students to both draw and engrave on wood and to prepare them to become commercial artists. Now, at the time, there were very few publishers who were ready to accept the work of women in the field. Herrick likely sacrificed some of his own business interests when he undertook to teach women to engrave on wood and prepared them to compete as equals with male artists and engravers. He was described by one of his students, pictured here, her name was Alice Dunleavy, who went on to be a successful artist. She specialized in wood engraving and illumination. And she said that he was, quote, a wonderful teacher who exerted a high moral influence on his students and was considered the backbone of the school. Herrick was also instrumental in gaining Peter Cooper's interest in the school. Cooper was a well-known inventor, industrialist, and philanthropist in New York, and he visited the school at the invitation of Herrick and was very impressed, and it was agreed that the school would be incorporated into the new Cooper Union for the Advancement of Sciences and Art that he was building, and a floor of that building was dedicated for the higher education of women in art. When the school moved and became part of the Cooper Union, which is still in existence today, in 1858, Herrick decided to leave the school to concentrate on his own work as an illustrator and a wood engraver. He opened an office in New York City, and during the Civil War was a leading engraver for Harper's Weekly. In 1865, at the age of 41, Herrick, along with his wife and children, returned to Manchester. And the reason for this was to care for his mother, who was recently widowed and needed some help. So they all moved into a house together at 97 Russell Street in Manchester. This is a daguerreotype of Herrick at the age of 32, right around the time that he would have moved back to Manchester. And this is the home that they lived in at 97 Russell Street. This is what it looks like today. Oddly enough, you would have thought that Herrick would have had a drawing of his home, but as far as we know, there is not one or any old photographs of the house. But here in Manchester, he continued to work as a designer and an engraver for firms in New York and Boston for about another 10 years. By this time, photography was beginning to replace woodblock and printing as a primary means for illustrating books and magazines. So that career was sort of dwindling at that point. There was less and less demand for wood engraving. A family member described this house as, quote, a square house with 2 chimneys on a dirt road with a barn and shed out back. It was painted brown with a red roof, and one end of the porch had been enclosed to create Mother's Cozy Corner, and its large windows had a flood of sun into her own special room. The house faced west, purportedly with a view of the Merrimack River originally, but within a few years, the view was closed in with other houses that were built close by. To the rear of the house, it was said that there remained an open country that rises gently to the new Dairyfield Park. By 1875, he again took up watercolor painting, which became his favorite branch of artwork. It was a medium that was growing in popularity at this time, and watercolors gave Herrick a more subtle way to engage the characters that he had been using in his engraving work. Not long before this, watercolors had been considered a, quote, lesser form of painting, with oil being the preferred method for serious students of art. In 1847, John Gadsby Chapman wrote this in his American Drawing Book, which was an instruction manual on painting. He said that, quote, oil was the medium for all who seriously undertook paintings, and starting too early with watercolors could only result in the formation of bad habits. Another critic wrote that watercolors had been looked upon as pretty fancy work, fit for girls and amateurs, and the term washy and weak have been universally applied to them. However, by the 1870s, watercolors were growing in popularity, and with it, an improvement in the number of and quality of watercolor pigments. So by the time of Herrick's death in 1906, watercolors had become a popular expressive art form. For the last few decades of his life, portraits and landscapes of the New Hampshire countryside in watercolor were a focus of his work. This is a description of his watercoloring procedure that was given by Maud Briggs Knowlton, who was another artist and director of the Currier Gallery of Art. She said that he first made a delicate outline drawing of the subject in India ink or pencil, to be completed later by applying his clear watercolor wash over the various portions of the painting. Lastly, he accented various spots in the composition where necessary in stronger touches of color. Around 1880, Herrick set up a studio in one of the first floor rooms of his house, and there he taught students his instruction with watercolor painting. The studio had a separate entrance for his students, and a family member recalled large watercolor paintings leaning against the walls in the studio with brushes kept in pots and a stained and dirty sink. His wife was not allowed to enter the studio to clean it.
Man cave.
Yes. One notable student of Herrick's was Frank French. French was a well-known portrait and landscape artist. He was born in Loudon, New Hampshire, and had an art studio in Manchester. In the 1870s, he served as the art director for the Mirror and Farmer newspaper, and with Herrick, in many ways, his career followed that of Herrick's. He worked in New York for the American Tract Society, later moved back to Manchester, where, along with Herrick, he helped organize the Manchester Art Association. French said of Herrick in a memoir, "Mr. Herrick, quote, was at the head of his profession. His engravings were characterized by the delicacy of light and shade, which were in demand by some of the best artists of that time." French also said, describing his relationship with Herrick, quote, "His criticism, patient help, and encouragement kept the grass from growing between his studio and mine." Another artist with Manchester and New York connections was a contemporary and friend of Herrick's, the sculptor John Rogers. Rogers was the subject of an exhibit here a year ago, and his famous statuary groups were mass-produced and very popular, selling over 80,000 in the course of his career. When Rogers decided to give his seated statue of Abraham Lincoln to the city of Manchester in 1895, it was Henry Herrick who helped to install it at its original Manchester location, the Old City Library on Franklin Street. Herrick also said this of his friend, "Rogers, when he was young, had a taste for drawing, and that seemed to smolder in him until one day he saw a sculptor modeling the image of a human face in clay, when a burning ambition to become a sculptor suddenly burst out of him. When the clay the Boston artist gave him had given out, it seemed he could not live without more clay, and we find him digging clay out of the Merrimack with his own hands that he might work out the many ideas that seemed to be boiling over in him since his discovery of a work that he loved." Many of Herrick's watercolors depicted scenes of the countryside in and around Manchester. A family member described his usual practice, quote, "Herrick roamed the countryside on foot, his hunting dog Grouse following at his heels, and set up his familiar easel before any view of farmhouse, lake, or country road which pleased him. With his paint box, the easel, and a folding stool, he was a familiar figure around Manchester." Lake Massabesic was a favorite subject of his. He found the, quote, "wilder parts of the shore to be particularly engaging subjects for his paintings, where trees overhung the water, and the Manchester Historic Association has 3 paintings that feature Lake Massabesic in our collection. One particular subject he frequently painted were the private residences of some of Manchester's notable citizens. It is likely that these were commissioned pieces by the owners who wished to have a painting of their home. And one example is this one here. This is the home of businessman James W. Hill at 269 Hanover Street. And interestingly, this later became the home of another prominent Manchester artist, Omer Lassonde, whose widow Louisa and Hill's niece donated this painting to the Historic Association. In 1882, Herrick authored the book Watercolor Painting, which is a work that was used for many years by those learning to paint in this medium, and we have a copy of that on display in the exhibit. Also beginning in 1882, Herrick painted a series of portraits of Manchester's first 25 mayors that were taken from photographs. You will see this impressive work on display in the exhibit, and at one time, these portraits all hung at Manchester City Hall. Today, copies of these portraits have been made, which are on display, along with portraits of subsequent mayors up to the current mayor today. You'll notice as you look at many of Herrick's landscape paintings that he included human figures added as small touches, but never as a central feature of the painting. Instead, they provide a sense of scale for the work. In his book, Herrick wrote that figure drawing is of first importance to the landscape artist by giving points of bright color and animation to a sketch. Here's another view. This is called Goves Mill, and he actually inserted himself in here as a self-portrait painting the scene in the lower left corner. Herrick also was very involved in civic life here in Manchester. He was a member of the First Congregational Church and was active in the Manchester City Mission, which was an organization that focused on the moral and religious instruction of the poor. He served as the mission's treasurer. This is a receipt that he signed as treasurer of the mission. And he was superintendent of the mission Sunday school for over 40 years and taught Sunday school there. It was said of him that he was a religious man in the best interpretation, always ready to assist those less fortunate than himself in an understanding of the Bible. His was a character that never lost sight of the sterling qualities of the early Puritan faith, from which in principle he never deviated. Herrick encouraged art in all its forms, frequently gave free lectures on art, and was one of the founders of the Manchester Art Association in 1871. And this organization later became absorbed into the Manchester Institute of Arts and Sciences, which became the New Hampshire Institute of Art. According to the organization's own report, the society was formed, quote, by a few ladies and gentlemen, amateur and professional artists, for the purpose of mutual instruction in the principles of art. And in 1879, Herrick was serving as one of the organization's directors. Herrick was also an historian. He wrote articles about General John Stark, and one article was published in Harper's Weekly, for which he interviewed a number of people who knew Stark, including his granddaughter, Abby Stark. In one of these articles, Herrick shows his admiration for the general, writing that Stark is, quote, regarded by the average reader of American history as a bluff, picturesque, and somewhat hard old soldier, rough in his treatment of all subjects in public and social life, carrying his purpose with a tenacity of will that would admit of no dispute or compromise. To a limited extent, this was true. He was like the shag-bark walnut tree of his native nut field, often rough on the surface, but within compact, fine, and enduring, with those qualities that we all admire and associate with our highest conceptions of true manhood and patriotism. John Stark was a very favorite subject of Herrick's, both in history, art, and poetry, and scenes from the life of the general were shown at the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia in 1876. And these are two of those drawings that were shown at the exposition. One of the last books that he illustrated was also related to John Stark. This was called The Hero of the Hills, and it was written by fellow historian George Waldo Brown. It was published in 1901 and featured some stories about John Stark, and at least one of his illustrations in the book was taken from an earlier watercolor, as you can see here. His interest in history led him to being one of the founders of the Manchester Historic Association, this organization, in 1896. He was one of the first vice presidents of the organization. This is a list of all of the founders of the association in 1896. And as I said, he was one of the first vice presidents and then served as the association's second president from 1900 to 1904. Herrick also wrote poetry. One poem, The Tomb of Stark, gives tribute to his favorite historical figure, John Stark. And these are in complete form in the exhibition, but I just took a sample of this one here. He said, "As from glory and honor to death thou descendest, 'twas meet thou shouldst lie by the Merrimack's wave. It was well thou shouldst sleep amongst the hills thou defendest, and take thy last rest in so simple a grave." And this is an engraving of John Stark's family gravesite that Herrick did. Another poem was called "The Humble Bee," and it echoes his Christian beliefs in the comparison that he makes of the dangers that a bee presents to a playing child to the dangers of sin. And the last two verses read here, "The pretty thing he grasped with glee, but quickly did he get, thrust in his hand by humble bee, its needle bayonet. With stamp and cries he runs to me, with bitter plaints of humble bee. Oh, heed, my boy, the lesson well, and let this truth abide, that danger lurks where pleasures dwell, and stings in ambush hide. No lasting joy earth's folly brings, and sin, like humble bee, hath stings." So in his later years, Henry W. Herrick spent his time in Manchester painting watercolors, teaching art at his home, and as I said, he was a familiar figure around town. He was often seen walking the streets, well-dressed, wearing a stovepipe hat, and carrying his easel and box of paints. At the time of his death, he was affectionately remembered as Manchester's grand old man of art. Henry Herrick died on June 30th, 1906, at the age of 81. And he died 4 years after his wife of over 50 years, Clarissa. Clarissa, or Clara Harlow Parkinson, was born in New Boston, New Hampshire, and married Henry W. Herrick on November 8th, 1849. The couple were childhood sweethearts, and Herrick actually returned to Manchester to marry her, and then they went back out to New York City where he was living. So they spent their early married life in Brooklyn before returning to Manchester in 1865. Clara was active in the Manchester community, and it was said of her that she was, quote, "one of the brightest, cheeriest spirits with which the community had been blessed. Many doors opened wide when she came up the walk." Clarissa died here in Manchester on August 16th, 1902, at the age of 77. And this is a daguerreotype of her, as well as a portrait that Herrick did of his wife. And this portrait of her was painted as a memorial by Henry shortly after her death. Here we have a family portrait of Henry, Clara, and their oldest son, Alan. Henry and Clarissa had 5 children, all sons, born between 1854 and 1868. 2 died as children, William at the age of 4 and Hurlbert at the age of 6. The sons who survived to adulthood were Alan, Robert, and Henry A. This is Robert. He was, as an adult, went into the ministry. He graduated from Hartford Theological Seminary in 1883 and served several churches in the Minneapolis area. Henry Augustus Herrick, as a young man, worked for the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company here in Manchester and studied engineering. He went on to work for the construction of mills in Methuen, Massachusetts, Willimantic, Connecticut, and Providence, Rhode Island. And he later worked for the Charles T. Main Company of Boston. He was frequently called away on long trips to various construction sites across the country, including the design and supervision of the construction of a dam and power station in Spokane, Washington, and the Black Eagle Falls Dam in Great Falls, Montana. Henry, his wife Bertha, and their 3 children lived around the corner from his parents at 242 Prospect Street. This is what that house currently looks like. Bertha, his wife, became one of her father-in-law's favorite models for his paintings, including this one here called Cinderella, which Herrick considered to be his finest figure piece. This painting is on loan to us. It's in our exhibition. It is owned by the Currier Museum of Art, and this is of Cinderella, and you can see the pumpkin in the corner as an indication that this is the girl from the fairy tale. Living so close to each other, Herrick became very close to his grandchildren, and Henry Augustus's daughter Alice, pictured here in a watercolor done by her grandfather, she had a very vivid memory of her grandfather and considered herself most fortunate to have lived next door to him during her childhood. Many of her memories were passed down to her children, and written as part of a manuscript in our archives. And that is how we've gotten some of the details of his life here from her memories. Living in between Henry the Elder and Henry the Younger was the oldest son of Henry and Clarissa, Alan Herrick, and this was his house at 91 Russell Street on the corner of Prospect. So we essentially had a Herrick family compound with the three houses pictured here in a modern day aerial view with Henry Sr.'s home up here on Russell. This is Alan's home, and then Henry Augustus right around the corner on Prospect. So Alan Herrick, the oldest, followed in his father's footsteps. He was both a wood engraver and an artist. He graduated from Manchester High School in 1873, and after school went to work for the Manchester Print Works as a draftsman, and then in 1902 became a teacher of shorthand at Manchester High School. This is a print engraving of the Massabesic Manufacturing Company done by Alan. And this is a group photo of the teachers at Manchester High School in 1905. And Alan is pictured in the back row at the far right. In 1914, he was appointed supervisor of penmanship for the entire Manchester public schools. But art remained a lifelong hobby of his, and he particularly loved painting the sea. During his summer vacations from school, he frequently visited the shore, where he studied and painted ocean and boating themes. And the Manchester Historic Association's collection here includes 8 watercolors by Alan, many of which are on display in this exhibit. So today, the Manchester Historic Association's collection contains a large number of Henry Herrick's paintings. It serves as the largest public depository for his works due to the generous contributions of donors over the last 125 years, including the artist himself. Before he died, he donated 4 paintings that he did to the association, which are on exhibit. His son Alan donated many of these paintings, and as well as other descendants and just other people who had acquired his works over the years. In 1947, an exhibit of many of his works was shown here at the Manchester Historic Association building on Amherst Street. It was said to be the first time that his works were displayed since his death in 1906. And so on November 21st, 1947, Maud Briggs Knowlton spoke at the association about Herrick as part of that first exhibition of his works. As many of you know, as I mentioned earlier, Ms. Knowlton was an accomplished artist. She was the first director of the Currier Gallery of Art, serving from 1929 to 1946. And so she, not long before giving this talk that she gave to the MHA, and she was one of the first female museum administrators in the United States and was personally acquainted with Herrick, which is why she was invited to come in and talk about him. So I'd like to read to you now a portion of her talk that spoke specifically about Herrick and her memories of Herrick. Knowlton recalled Herrick as, quote, a gentleman well advanced in years, a man of average masculine height, rather inclined to obesity, with keen blue eyes peering out from rather heavy, overhanging eyelids, firm mouth and chin, rather prominent straight nose, wearing his hair, which was almost white, of a length that permitted it to rest on the collar of his black broadcloth coat. She said, I never remember seeing him attired otherwise than in a suit of black, shiny broadcloth, tailored in the period style of loose, baggy trousers, and full-skirted coat reaching to his knees. His manner of walking was quite different from that of people in the present day who were always in a rush to get nowhere. His was a moderate gait, accented by an occasional scuffling around the heels of his shoes, as though they fitted none too closely, but were exceedingly comfortable. His hands I remember distinctly. These were rather large and strong, with stocky fingers, tapering towards the nails, indicating a sensitive touch, which is easily discernible when one examines one of his drawings. She also gave an amusing account of his visiting her art studio one time. She said, I clearly remember his visit to my studio at the time of the first public exhibition of my watercolors in this city. Far down the corridor in the first Kennard building, I could hear the measured tread of his feet as he approached the door of the studio, with tall silk beaver hat, somewhat in need of brushing, held easily in his hand. On entering, he gazed around the walls at my watercolors. This exhibition must have been a great shock to him. At that period, Impressionism was coming to the fore, with paintings executed in brilliant, broken color, quite different from the method of the sweeps or washes of clear, jewel-like color as employed by him. After examining my work at length, his only remark was, "You use a brush well loaded with color." Whether this was faint praise or condemnation of my work, I never knew. And so finally, I think it is appropriate to read the words of Maud Briggs Knowlton on the importance and impact that Herrick had. She said, "We of today can scarcely realize what it meant to be the lone representative in a community of a phase of life as exacting in its demands as that of an artist of Mr. Herrick's ability and of his period." Art meant very little to the majority of people in Manchester, who were at that time mainly engaged with the business of amassing wealth in an expanding textile city. Very few homes could boast of worthwhile paintings or prints. Now, the works of this distinguished Manchester painter and engraver are to be found in many homes and cultural institutions in our country. Today, we are able to evaluate the artwork of Henry W. Herrick as that of one who stood as the head of his profession during the period in which he worked both as engraver and as painter. She went on to say, "We of New Hampshire are honored in the privilege of counting him as one of our most gifted artists and as a representative citizen who never deviated from the use of sound principles both in his walk through life and in his profession." In 1969, another large show called The World of Henry W. Herrick was exhibited at the MHA, including many works on loan from the Currier Gallery of Art, the New Hampshire Historical Society, and private collections. And at that time, my predecessor, Virginia Plisco, said of Herrick, she said, "Despite his prominence as a 19th century engraver and the excellence of his watercolors, Henry W. Herrick seems to have been largely forgotten outside of Manchester. History shows him to have been an exceptional person, and his paintings and engravings affirm his excellence as an artist. It is hoped that this exhibition will give him the contemporary recognition which he so rightly deserves." And so now, over 50 years later, I echo her hope for new generations that this exhibition here and this talk will give you and all those who have seen it an appreciation for Henry Herrick, a versatile artist and once affectionately referred to as Manchester's grand old man of art. So thank you very much for coming today. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to attempt to answer them. But then I certainly do encourage everyone to go and take another look, or a first look if you haven't been, of our exhibit. So, thank you.
Where,
Yes?
just sort of tangential, but where is the John Stark grave?
At Stark Park,
Oh,
like
right.
down to the back by the river. Yeah.
You just recently had the house open. I went to. It was great.
Oh, the birthplace? Yeah.
Okay.
Good.
So you're there. You get around.
Hope to see you in October.
All right. Thanks again for coming, everyone.